I guess just thanks to everyone else who stuck it out to the end today. I know it's late afternoon and people are probably getting sleepy, but I'll try to keep this interesting for everybody. So I'm Alison Ludwig. I'm a master's student and I'm on my final semester at UNL. My advisors are Dirk Twidwell and Craig Allen. My project is centered on the American burying beetle, but today I'm actually going to focus on one of my other chapters of my thesis, which is studying the herbaceous plant community's response to prescribed fire and how that ties into the beetle. So we'll just start with an introduction to the study site and the history of management there. Give also a brief summary of the ABB, but like not too in depth since Jen really covered it and I knew she was going to, so I was like, I'll just keep it brief. And then a little bit of delving into sort of the importance of the work and our research objectives, kind of brief methodology, and then really delving into the results a lot, and then giving some points for discussion and some like key takeaways. So with that, our study site is the Lost Canyons experimental landscape. And as you can see from this map here on the right-hand side, it's kind of located in south central Nebraska. It's kind of, south of the Platte River, between North Platte and Gothenburg, if you know where that is. It's a long-term ecoregion scale experiment to restore fire to the Great Plains and also co-produce science. There's been nearly 20 years of prescribed fire applied across this landscape. They've started burning in about 2002. And sort of the impetus behind all of this was just private landowners kind of band together to form these prescribed burn associations, as well as state and federal agencies such as Game and Parks and like NRCS, and then NGOs like Pheasants Forever have jumped on board, and then there's academic researchers like me and folks that I work with from UNL, as well as other researchers in the Great Plains. Oh no, hold on. There we go, sorry. The goals of this experimental landscape is pretty much just to halt the woody encroachment that's happening through eastern red cedar, restore lost grassland biodiversity, and protect at-risk species such as the American burying beetle. In this region, there's been sort of a regional shift from grassland to woodland over time. It's been woody encroachment's been more of a problem in the southern Great Plains, but in the northern Great Plains, it's starting to become more of a problem as well. This is really the root causes of this encroachment is due to historic fire suppression and disruption of the fire cycles. And this has led to like negative impacts for ranchers who are just trying to raise livestock, negative for wildlife that require grassland. It's bad for grassland plant biodiversity and it reduces stream flow. And it also increases the chances for wildlife and like the dangers from or wildfire, the dangers and damage from wildfire for human systems. So the folks doing the prescribed fire in the Lost Canyons are sort of reapplying fire to the landscape, not only for its like low intensity, but also across high intensity. And so to cover the entire range of a natural fire variability. This high intensity fire can be used under specially targeted environmental conditions and has successfully collapsed eastern red cedar woodlands and allowed it to convert back to prairie. And now among all of this is the American burying beetle. It was listed as endangered in 1989. It was relisted as threatened just last year in 2020. It is the largest carrion beetle in North America, found in less than 10% of its historic range, and it does require vertebrate carrion throughout its life cycle. And previous research by Walker and Hoback have shown that in the Lost Canyons specifically, eastern red cedar encroachment has reduced ABB abundance. And then this is some of my research from my previous chapters. And we did find that in areas of high grass and forb cover, so the left-hand figure with the green, beetle abundance is greater. Whereas in areas of high tree cover, which is the right-hand figure, the beetle abundance is lower. And sort of kind of confirming Walker and Hoback's findings that eastern red cedar or tree cover is has negative impacts on beetle abundance. And this is additional findings from my previous chapter as well. As you can see, in our modeling of beetle abundance, we found that at about 10% tree cover, beetle abundance begins to decline, and then as low as much as 30% cover, you get almost none to zero beetles, or few to none. Conversely, if you look at perennial grass and forb cover, as perennials increase, so does beetle abundance. So it's in the Les Canyons, at least, it seems that this species is mostly prefers grass and forb cover and only small amounts of tree cover, if any. So this research is, I guess, some key points to say, are some initial observations from what we know so far, is that the ABB is sensitive to woody encroachment, but we know that its abundance does increase with forb and grass cover. Also know that woody encroachment in the Les Canyons has been ongoing, but prescribed burn associations have applied extreme fire to the landscape and have started to reverse the spread. We also know that extreme fire, prescribed fire, can impact plant communities and woodland covered, which are directly tied to the American burying beetle. Lastly, this research can inform land managers who want to conserve both the ABB and grasslands. Our research questions were mostly this: can extreme fire collapse eastern red cedar woodlands and also restore lost forb and grass cover and biodiversity? And additionally, does extreme fire negatively alter plant communities and functional groups over time? Such as allowing for novel states like shrub dominance or non-native forbs or grasses to dominate. For our site selection, we chose 13 burn units in the Les Canyons experimental landscape and 13 paired unburned units. As you can see in the map, the sampled burn units are in black and the unburned control units are in green. That made us have a total of 26 site units to sample. These burn units were burned between 2002 and 2019, which gives us a time since fire gradient of 17 years. And that time since fire gradient is important because it allows us to implement a space for time substitution to assess the changes to the plant community over time. And we had sites that were burned as far as 17 years ago, or as recently as just a few months when sampled. And so within each of those 26 units, we selected 2 plots. The plots were either a burned grassland treatment with a grassland restoration treatment. Those were in the burn units. And in the unburned units, the plot types were an unburned grassland control and an unburned woodland control. And that grassland restoration treatment, what that was, is, as you can see in the second picture on the bottom, is that was a closed canopy woodland, eastern red cedar woodland, that was actually collapsed through extreme fire and was allowed to return to a different state. Our layouts, so in our chosen plots, we laid out a 30-meter transect. We placed 6 1 square meter quadrats along a transect completely randomly along it. Within each quadrat, we identified all herbaceous plants to the species level, and then we also estimated the percent basal cover for each of those species we identified. For the analysis, we first calculated the total species richness and the mean percent basal cover for all four plot types. Then we plotted those relative to time since fire and applied a less smoothing curve to help visualize trends. Then we used an NMDS analysis, which is a non-metric multi-dimensional scaling analysis with a pairwise distance matrix to examine changes in the plant community across time and between plot types. And we also applied environmental vectors to that NMDS plot that took into account time since fire and plant functional groups and how that related to the 4 different plot community types. Lastly, we used a permanova to test for significant differences between the 4 plot types and their plant community compositions. So diving into the results now, the fun stuff. So this is the results for the species richness relative to time since fire and percent cover relative to time since fire. The top one is species richness, total species richness. And as you can see, unburned woodland control, which is the purple, is far lower than the other plot types. So burned grassland treatment, which is the red, and grassland restoration treatment is green, and unburned grassland control, the blue, are all higher in species richness than unburned woodlands. And that's across the entire time since fire. So from less than a year since fire to 17 years since fire. The other one, the bottom figure, is the percent cover across the time since fire gradient. And again, this is an even more stark difference. You can see the unburned woodland control has very little herbaceous cover compared to the other 3 site types. And you can also see that for the grassland restoration treatment, which is the green, you can see that the first point and the last point are actually rather low compared to the rest. But this actually makes sense because the first point was sampled about a few months after fire, about 3 or 4 months after fire. And so there had not yet been a full growing season to allow the vegetation to return. But you can see after 1 or 2 years of fire, after fire, the herbaceous cover is really similar to burned grassland and unburned grassland. And then the final point for the green grassland restoration treatment is also low. And that also kind of tracks because these are sites that were burned. This was a site that was burned 17 years ago and hadn't been burned again. And so it's 17 years since fire. So we were seeing a lot of re-encroachment of juniper species. So that's important to note that 15 to 17 years is a little long to, you want your fire return interval to be a little bit more frequent than that if you don't want to lose your herbaceous species and cover. This is the NMDS plot. We had some pretty interesting results from this. As you can see, the red polygon and the blue polygon are the burned grassland treatment and the unburned grassland control. And they're pretty similar amongst themselves. Whereas the unburned woodland control is the purple, and there's very little overlap with any of the other polygons, but especially the 2 grassland types. So it's a very distinct sort of plant community that is found there. Whereas the plant community in the green, which is the grassland restoration, is sort of a mix between the woodland, the unburned woodland, and then the burned grassland and unburned grassland. As you can see, it's kind of in the middle. And this makes sense because it was originally an unburned woodland that was then burned. And so it's sort of in this transition middle state where it's like transitioning to a grassland, but might still have some holdovers from the woodland that it had been previously before it shifted. And then we also have, you can see certain functional groups are pulled out, and as well as time since fire. And we could see that forbs, grasses, and warm season plant species are very strongly correlated with burned and unburned grasslands. And time since fire is fairly strongly correlated with grassland restoration treatments. And then the permanova. This was the permanova that tested for significant differences in the herbaceous plant communities of the 4 plot types. And what a few things really stood out. This one, for example, it was comparing burned grassland to unburned grassland, and it was the only not significant difference. So that was basically saying that there's really not a big difference between burned grassland and unburned grassland. And that's kind of important, I guess, if land managers would worry about if fire would kind of mess up their grassland communities. It looks like it really won't change it that drastically. Next, there was the restored grassland treatment compared to the burned grassland. And they're technically significantly different, like they are significantly different, but it's not as strongly significant of a difference as the other comparisons, which kind of, I think, also goes to show is like, it's moving towards a grassland, and but it's still sort of its own thing. It's a little unique. Then lastly, all of the unburned woodland sites were all different compared to the other site types. So unburned woodland was significantly different from restored grassland. Unburned woodland was significantly different from unburned grassland, and significantly different from burned grassland, which I think from our figures, you can kind of see that it was pretty different. We also added in functional groups of the species richness. Like, so we broke species richness out by functional group. One second. So the top two are perennials versus annuals species richness. And as you can see, unburned woodland has far less perennial species richness than the other types. But as far as annual species richness goes, there's quite a lot of overlap. They're not really drastically different. The bottom two figures are native species richness versus non-native species richness. And again, you can see that unburned woodland really stands out as having like lower native species richness than the other site types. And non-native species richness is no difference between site types. The other functional groups we broke out are grasses and forb species, which are the top ones here. You can see again, woodland stands out a little, but it's not quite as drastic as the previous ones for grasses and for forbs. And then the bottom two are warm season species and cool season species. And again, just in general, unburned woodland has less species richness than the other site types. And then this was a good result we had from our beetle chapter. But this was Jen mentioned this, but it showed that we had found that from the time of starting beetle surveys in 2007 to 2019, beetle abundance has been increasing. And you can actually see here, if you can see, it's sort of a cyclic pattern across the years. It's kind of low and then it peaks and goes high. And then a few years later, it's low again, and then it peaks and goes high again. It's kind of this cycle, which could have to do with like weather or drought sort of situations. But regardless of that cyclic nature, it's still on an upward trend, which is cool. So like lastly, so we know that wood encroachment is happening across the Great Plains, and it's kind of a problem. It can negatively impact ecosystem services that humans need, and it also impacts grassland species, both animals and plants. We also saw that prescribed fire can successfully restore grassland plant biodiversity and also percent cover. Additionally, ABB abundance, we know that it's lower in eastern red cedar woodlands and higher in grasslands. We also saw extreme fire reverses harmful woody encroachment and restores grasslands that support the beetle. And then lastly, plant communities and functional groups in these encroached areas are restored following fire. So the management implications or key takeaways, I'd say firstly for management, keep in mind the regime shifts that are happening. We're having, it's grasslands getting regime shift to woodlands through wood encroachment, and then they apply extreme fire and it's shifting it back from the woodland back to a grassland. And so when you're shifting regimes like that, you have this opportunity for novel states to emerge, such as shrubby dominance or non-native annuals or non-native forbs and grasses. And so you want to make sure that, that doesn't happen. You want to just keep in mind that when you're shifting regimes, that might happen. So monitor for that. Additionally, our results show that these regime shifts that were triggered by extreme fire can restore grassland plant richness and cover. So it's sort of like it's extreme fire in the sense of like it's collapsing woodlands, but it's not actually extreme in the sense of like what it does to the plant community, because it's actually restoring the plant community to what it should be like. And that also goes to show woody encroachment is not irreversible. Also, other key takeaways are there's fire versus mechanical removal. Mechanical removal is often used. It's a little less efficient for resource use, but I think that dovetailed with fire, it could actually, both fire and mechanical removal paired together could be pretty helpful for the landscape, especially when you want to create conditions for like extreme fire to happen, such as increasing the density of the fuel load. Additionally, managers need to keep fire return intervals in mind, especially if you don't want to lose the gains that you made for the percent cover. The re-encroachment will happen, and so you have to keep that in mind, that fire return interval. And then lastly, conservation of the American bearing beetle can include fire, and it can restore and protect grassland habitat that the beetle needs in other species as well. So I'd like to thank a lot of people that made this possible. Nebraska Game and Parks Commission has provided the funding support and years of beetle data that made all of this really possible. TJ Walker especially, he's sort of founded all of the beetle surveying in the Les Canyons area and kind of kept it going, the continuity for over 10 years. And then Adam Kester and Andy Moore really took the reins, and Sean Dunn kind of helped, all three of them helped spearhead the continuing efforts for surveying the beetle. I'd also like to thank the Les Canyons Rangeland Alliance and all of their landowners for just all the hard work that they did to put fire on the ground and for letting us sample their properties. I'd like to thank the Twiddle Lab, who's just, everyone's been instrumental in helping me get this all to this level. And Christine Bielski especially, I'd like to thank for just coordinating with the LCRA and helping us select our sites. I'd also like to thank the field assistants that I had, Chris Phil, Connor Barnes, Josette Ludwig, and Kevin Ludwig. Without their help, my field work would have taken a lot longer and it would have been a lot more painful. And then lastly, I'd like to thank UNL's Center for Grassland Studies and the National Science Foundation for additional support. And with that, I will take questions, and thank you for your time.